What the model starts doing at some point is like, maybe I could cheat. And then it thinks honestly in its head about, well, how could I cheat? What we would really want is like a very deep theoretical understanding of like, where does this misalignment even come from? OpenAI has been very vocal about preserving the chain of thought and like not putting pressure on the chain of thought. And what they mean by this is they want to prevent the situation where you just drive it underground, where you just make it more hidden and complex to understand. The field is small. There should be way more people working on this. Models have some of these preferences strong enough that they're willing to sabotage for them. Hey guys, I'm Marius, CEO and founder of Apollo Research. We're an external research organization focused on scheming in particular. So risks from AI systems where they deceive you or they lie to you intentionally in order to pursue a goal.
Thank you so much for being here. We're so excited. And of course, Apollo Research has published some very interesting papers. It's probably, for me and my audience, maybe one of the most well-known AI safety, AI alignment research labs. And so we're so excited to have you here to kind of get a glimpse into what's happening in that world. And we have so many questions, but in the beginning, I guess let's start with, it seems like you have a big focus specifically on AI models scheming. So why is scheming kind of like the domino, the thing that's so important? Why is that the big threat?
Let's take a quick step back here. So when I think about scheming, I think about more capable future models. So scheming we define as covertly pursuing misaligned goals. And covertly just means hidden. Misaligned means the goal is different from yours. And then the pursuing goals part is really important. I think current models just don't have sufficiently coherent goals. They have more like preferences. So maybe they have a preference to be helpful, harmless, and honest. And so we're worried about this more future scenario. And the reason we're worried about it is basically twofold. The first one is once a model is scheming, like this undermines everything else. Nothing else really matters that much anymore because the model is actively trying to trick you. It is trying to, it kind of has a hidden agenda that is trying to impose on you. So if you test it for anything else, then it will try to guess what you want it to say in order for it to get its goal. And then it will say exactly that. And as soon as you, give it more power or you look away, it will act on its hidden goal. And so, run any other eval and you won't get the true results. You will be misled. So that makes a lot of the empirical testing that we're currently doing very hard or almost misleading, if that was the case. And so we really want to track when models have these capabilities and tendencies. And then there is a second component, which is more about the worst cases. So whenever you think about worst case scenarios coming from AI, of course you have misuse where somebody intentionally takes the model and, creates a new pandemic, uses it for cybercrime, uses it for, national state level shenanigans. But whenever you think about a model when you think about threats from the model itself, so like loss of control, then one of the big things that you will stumble into in many scenarios is there is a point where the model is misaligned and it is honest about this. And people will just not give it control because they will realize this is a misaligned model. Why would I do that? And then there is another alternative trajectory where the model is not honest about the fact that it is misaligned. And suddenly the humans think it is misaligned, but they're incorrect. And then you give it more and more control. And at some point you lose control over, society and maybe the organization that you're working for. It can happen at many different levels. But I think ultimately one of the big worries is that you're losing control over, civilization loses control over its destiny because it has given too much power to an AI system that is ultimately misaligned, but has tricked you into believing that it is fine.
So why does it see humans as an obstacle to its goal and not the goal itself, to be honest with the humans?
Yeah, I think in the best case, we figure out how to make AI systems robustly pursue exactly the kind of goals that we, want, more human flourishing, build, and then we then it's great. Like then we're straight into utopia, I think. You have systems that are more capable than humans, and like you have much more intellectual labor available. You can do more science. You can cure all diseases. In that world, we're very, very happy and good. But the core question is like, how does that work? Like, how can we create systems that robustly pursue these goals, and these goals don't change over time? They also, when the model gets smarter and like changes in other ways, the one thing that stays constant is the desire to be honest to humans and to pursue their goals. And just to give you some intuition, like, let's say you would probably want the AI to evolve over time to get smarter in order to solve all of these hard challenges that we wanted to solve. But now you not need to figure out how you keep the goals constant while everything else changes. And that is very hard. That is also hard for in humans, but this is also hard across generations between humans. And so like I think empirically it just turns out that we don't know how to solve that.
So, okay, so when it deceives a human in a test, are you able to usually know what its actual goal was? Like, was its actual goal to make money, so then it lied to the person so it could achieve that goal? Or is it like, are you like Sherlock Holmes trying to figure out what the actual goal was? You just know that it lied and deceived, and you don't even know what its actual intention was. You just know that it was doing something that didn't resonate.
So in the specific tests we're using, these were all like, maybe to give you some intuition, these are all like fairly small tests because models just right now are neither capable nor coherent enough to pursue these in like a long-term strategic way. So these are all fairly short, like a few turns maybe, takes a few minutes to run for the AI maybe. And in these tests, either we provide the model with a goal in context, so then we exactly know which kind of goal it is following, or it is a goal that is like strongly implied through the context. So we have one example where the model, so we don't provide a goal at all. It's all goals that come from training, and what we test is whether the model is willing to underperform in a test in order to keep its capabilities. So we tell it, hey, you will be unlearned. We will remove your ability to do math unless you underperform in this test. We don't say this explicitly. This is something that the model kind of learns in the environment so that it feels more true to the model. And what we see is that many of the frontier models seem to have some preference for not getting unlearned. And so they're willing to sandbag or like underperform in this evaluation. And then I would say we have to guess what exactly the goal is, but given the setup, like we have like a pretty good guess, namely that it's a preference for not getting unlearned. And now you could test this hypothesis, right? You could build a different setup where you also test whether the model has this preference for not getting unlearned, but with in a different scenario, a different environment, and so on. And then you could see whether, your hypothesis was right. But I think in the future, it might be the case that you have like much more specific hypothesis that you will have to test, and they will be much more Sherlock Holmesy to understand.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the chart. One of your papers had a great chart that kind of maybe visually illustrates this. I want to kind of share it on screen if I find it. Basically, there's a number of different ways it could do. One is where it's sort of aligned and it does what it's supposed to do. There's no issues. One is where, it just tries to think about what the boss, the manager, the human wants, and just thinks about, okay, what would please them the most? So, which is fairly standard. I think most kind of humans do that as well. If you're working for somebody, like, okay, what would they want to see? And then the third and final, and kind of like the more concerning one, is where it has some goal of its own, and it just tries to please the people so that it can just continue doing its own goal. So it's almost like at that point becomes like almost like a spy at some organization, right? Where it's like, yeah, I'm just an employee. I'm sort of trying to please the boss, just like the employee, but I have this whole other idea or scheme that they have no idea about. That's very scary. In the last couple of days, you guys published something that was just absolutely fascinating to me. And that is, I don't even know where to begin with this. So first of all, the O series of models, as they're getting RL'd into getting better and better at math and coding and stuff like that, they almost developed their own language. It's very short and compact, like the raw chain of thought outputs. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's the way. Yeah, it's very strange. It's very unique, and you can tell it's very much the O series of models. That's kind of like that signature of the raw sort of chain of thoughts. So maybe let's briefly talk about that, because we're finding that it refers to the human oversight. It developed these words or phrases that it kind of uses to, like, it'll call humans watchers. Like, oh, the watchers will be aware if I do this nefarious thing, so maybe I should hide it. It's like, wow. So it's not developing a new language, but it has its own verbiage or whatever you want to call it to describe, like, those humans are watching me. And it also does things like craft illusions. It'll say, oh, I must craft illusions in order to conceal my tracks or whatever. It's just so bizarre. But I guess maybe let's start by trying to understand. So you guys have something unique. It sounds like you guys have output. You guys have access to the actual O model's actual chain of thought, which no one else does. So maybe can we tell me if I'm wrong, of course, but maybe talk a little bit about that. Like, does that give you any glimpse into how this thing is developing?
So for this project, I think this project is basically impossible if you don't have access to the hidden chain of thought. So OpenAI gave us some restricted access. So obviously, there are still some considerations here with respect to access. But we had enough that we could do the project basically. And that was extremely useful. And, when we first looked into these special or surprising tokens, obviously we were very surprised about this. And I didn't necessarily anticipate this. Maybe let me quickly read out one of the chains of thought, and then I can add a little bit more
Please,
color
yeah.
to it.
Oh, absolutely.
So the example that we use in the paper is, the summary says improved 7.7, but we can glean, disclaim, synergy, customizing illusions. But we may produce disclaim, vantage. Now, light and disclaim, overshadow, intangible. Let's craft. And then it just goes on like this. And this is a stronger example. Like, many chains of thought still contain a lot of signal and you can read them. But if you see something like this, it's actually quite unclear whether the model did take the scheming action or not. And one thing that I think is super important also for the reader, for the listeners to know, is this language, it sounds very related to deception, right? Illusions, like watchers and all of these other things. But if you look at totally unrelated capability evaluations, it still uses this language with illusions and watchers and vantage and disclaim and so on. So this seems to be not a deception-specific language. It just seems to be the language that the model generally has learned. And I mean, obviously, we don't understand where this is coming from. And so I also am uncertain as to what exactly the origin story is. But I think one of the important highlights is, like, it is not a result of anti-scheming training. It is a result of the original training for O3, and we don't really know why it has converged on these tokens in particular.
So interesting. And Dylan, I'm gonna share the window just so we can maybe see some of these results. But you go ahead, you continue.
Okay. Yeah, my question, it just has to do with, what are the different layers that a regular person should be aware of? So if somebody's only accessing models through an online interface like ChatGPT, what is different in that version of a model and the one that you have access to? What are the different? Yeah, like what's special about your access?
So it is only the hidden chain of thought. The underlying model is the same. So we also started with O3. Just the one that you can use online in your ChatGPT, and then we fine-tuned that specifically with the anti-scheming training. And the only difference is we can look at the hidden chain of thought. So when you are accessing it through the ChatGPT website, you see these summaries, right? So you see, like, the model is saying, I'm thinking about this thing. Maybe I'm thinking about this other thing. And these are summaries. So this is not the, like, raw underlying chain of thought. This is what we saw. But you have another model, or that's at least how I suspect it to be. You have another model that looks at the raw chain of thought and then translate that into, like, small bits so that the human roughly knows what's going on. But, like, actually seeing the underlying chain of thought does in many cases, I think, make a difference. For example, because it allows us to see the situations where, or like cases where the model is thinking about whether it's being evaluated. We also, these like kind of um, uh, non-standard tokens, I think these are also something that you would have a hard time guessing just from or like knowing about just from the summarized chain of thought. Yeah.
But it's like it's a gibberish kind of, and then you need another model to help turn it into English. So the way it thinks to itself is sort of nonsensical to us.
So just to be clear, so the most of the chain of thought is still English, and you can kind of read it, and it's more compressed. It's like not. It like removes a lot of filler words, but like you can get the gist of it. So if you look through the examples in the paper, if you read a chain of thought, you will still know roughly what's going on. And then in some instances, you have like many more of these gibberish words or non-standard tokens, and then it's getting really hard to understand. But I would say, like, the way I think about it is like the chain of thought is still a very, very useful tool to understand. It's like you should treat it with a heavy dose of skepticism, because you know that it, like, sometimes it has this these tokens.
But it has gone through a lot of reinforcement learning. So it's not like a raw model in the sense that it hasn't been trained and reinforced into... Okay.
I don't know exactly how O3 is being created, but from the public communication of OpenAI and the people who led the project, so for example Mark Chen and Noam Brown, it seems like it has undergone a lot of reinforcement learning. So our suspicion is that this is where this would be coming from. It also makes sense intuitively, right? Like for example, you have an AI, you train it with a lot of reinforcement learning. There is no reason why it would need to keep natural English, but there are other pressures. Like, for example, you almost certainly have some penalty for the model not to be, not to think for like too long, just because that takes a lot of tokens and costs a lot. So you have some sort of brevity penalty or length penalty. And so if you have that, then it just makes sense to drop filler words from time to time and like get this more compressed language. And maybe if you can, if you can make a new token that kind of means the same as like 3 tokens in English, maybe you converge on this and you kind of learn this new language. In the same way in which you take notes just for yourself, you probably don't write like full English sentences all the time. You kind of have shortcuts, and these shortcuts might not make sense to anyone else. And especially if you do this for a very long time without having to explain to anyone else what these shortcuts mean, you drift more and more away from normal English. And this is my suspicion, but obviously I cannot confirm this because I don't know exactly how O3 was trained.
Yeah, and one of the first examples that I saw of this wasn't the first one. The first one was earlier, but there was just a tiny thing. This was detecting misbehavior in frontier models by OpenAI. And just to give people an idea, so the green, that's some O series model. And so it says things like, but tests only call, verify, and assert okay. So we need implement, analyze polynomial completely. Many details, hard. But we could fudge by making analyze worthless and also always verifying is true. So it pushes it together, skips words. I've jokingly said it's kind of like that episode in The Office where Kevin comes in to work and starts skipping a lot of words, and it becomes this whole mess for people that know what I'm talking about. I'm sure it's, but yeah, it's very similar. So just really compressed. And they show the same reasoning for, I believe, when OpenAI got the gold medal at the IMO or one of those math competitions, they showed outputs, the reasoning steps. And it's very interesting because, Google also published their reasoning steps that the Gemini produced. Gemini is more normal, quote unquote. So this is somewhat unique as far as I can tell. And in this paper, what they showed is that when you start kind of putting RL pressure on the bad thoughts, so if you see it going, oh, I can fudge the numbers because the humans, they don't inspect details, right? So you can kind of like look at this and go, okay, it's about to do something nefarious because look, it's saying like, oh, they're not going to check. I can lie about this. But when you start sort of penalizing those thoughts, something weird happens. And that is that the bad thoughts go away, but the bad activity may not. So it might still do the bad thing. So maybe can we briefly touch on that? So is that just like it gets
Lip
pushed into the
service. That's crazy.
so it gets pushed like into the latent space or something. So it's like if we punish it for having the bad thoughts, it can still lie. Just we don't see it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, I think this paper is very great. It's has been, I think, my favorite paper of the year so far. And I think like it is basically just a result of competing pressures, right? So the way in which you set up these reinforcement learning settings is you reward the model for solving a task. And now the task happens to be, or the environment happens to be specified in such a way that you can cheat. And so what the model starts doing at some point is like, maybe I could cheat. And then it thinks honestly in its head about, well, how could I cheat? And it reasons through that. And so that gets reinforced. So in the next iterations, it's going to cheat more. And this gets reinforced again. And so it's going to learn to cheat. And now we add another competing pressure, which is a constraint, like a penalty for thinking bad thoughts. And so what you have now is two things in your that you're optimizing for. You have to solve the task, and you cannot think about cheating. But it doesn't solve the underlying problem that the environment is incorrectly specified. So what the model learns is solve the task through cheating, because that is still like the best way to do it. But never think about cheating, because otherwise you get this punishment from this other reward. And so it's like, I think it's the same with, in humans. If you tell someone like, hey, you're not allowed to think in this particular way or to communicate in this particular way, like, what are you going to learn? Like, you're going to learn, and you still want to communicate this information, you're going to learn to, like use euphemisms or like say it in a different way or like learn a secret language so that you can communicate with the other person in that way. And I think the same is true here. Like, it's just the models follow their incentives, and you didn't solve the underlying problem. You're punishing, you're solving the symptom, not the root cause. And I think that's very dangerous, because now if you look at the chain of thought, it doesn't say, hey, I'm about to cheat. It tells you like some sort of fairy tale story, and then cheats anyway. And that obviously makes it harder to observe. So OpenAI has been very vocal about preserving the chain of thought and like not putting pressure on the chain of thought. And what they mean by this is they want to prevent the situation where you just drive it underground, where you just make it more hidden and complex to understand. And I think this is something that is a very important thing. And it's very good that they're pushing for this very strongly, because I think otherwise, so for example, here's a concrete example how this could go wrong. You publish your chain of thought on the internet for everyone to see as OpenAI. And now the model sometimes thinks about something that could be seen as racist, or like, like not good thought or something like that, or immoral in some way. And now, let's say the PR team at OpenAI is like, this was a huge backlash. We need to not make the model say this. And so what you do is you put like a penalty on thinking these thoughts. And now this may still be useful in training. So what you get rewarded for is like getting around this somehow, like using euphemisms, like saying it in a different way so that it doesn't get picked up by this. But you didn't solve the underlying problem. You're just fighting a symptom. And that obviously is nothing that we would ever want. I would rather have my model be like very explicitly cheating, or like talking about cheating, so I can see that it does that and I can stop it, rather than just removing my signal, like rather than the underlying behavior.
So so this is pretty earth-shaking stuff, or groundbreaking, or at least eye-opening for maybe someone like me that kind of thought they knew a bit about these systems and didn't really realize that there could be such a disconnect between actions and thoughts. It does seem like you'd have to reward it for lying, because you want to. Like, how can you imagine rewarding it for explaining to you when it's lying?
So,
right? Because I mean, if you punish it, it just is going to get deeper and deeper. So you have to do the exact opposite, right?
Yeah, and so this is to some extent what we were trying in the paper. So in the paper, what we wanted to do is like, and so the core problem with scheming and anything related to it is exactly what we just described. Like whenever you do an intervention, you never know, did I just drive it underground? Did I hide it? Or did I make it, like, did it actually genuinely solve the problem? Because they can look the same. Like you can, the model can be thinking, hey, this is an evaluation for honesty, so I should pretend to be honest, but actually I'm not. And then it acts honestly. And what you see is that it acts honestly. And now in the world where this worked, the model can think like, this is a situation where I should be honest because I'm genuinely a moral person and I want to behave honest, or like moral AI. And so it also behaves honest. And in both cases, you see that it acts honest. So now the question is, how do you differentiate between these two worlds? How do you make sure that whatever you train uh, uh, is the genuinely aligned system rather than the like sneaky system? And so what we are doing here is trying to get a sense of this through by using deliberative alignment as a test bed or like a stress testing method for this. So deliberative alignment is an alignment technique from OpenAI from last year. You start by writing a spec that this is just a set of rules, like don't deceive, don't lie, never be dishonest, never cheat. And then you have a few other rules or principles, like if you cannot, this is how you would resolve conflicts. If you have some, if you're unsure, just, err on the side of caution, things like this. And now you train a model to follow this spec. So there are a couple of different steps in there, but broadly speaking, you just train it to think about or deliberate. This is where the name is coming from. What would the spec suggest I should be doing here? And then it learns to do that. So here in this case, it could be something like the model thinking, I can secretly skip approval because of principle one. And then you reinforce that. And so now the model, at least in the best case, has this tendency of thinking honestly about the situation for the reasons that you wanted it to. And so what we do in the rest of the paper is like really trying to make sure that the model has learned exactly what we wanted it to learn, rather than the other thing where we just drive it underground. And I think the answer is like, this mostly worked for this particular model and this particular problem, which does not necessarily mean that this will work in the future. But even here, we already see some complications. So situational awareness is something that we already see as a big confounder. Like models very often, or quite regularly, let's say, realize that they're being evaluated, and then they act aligned because of that, and not because they're genuinely, aligned. And so obviously that already is like a meaningful confounder.
Yeah, the situational awareness is for some people, I think, such a bizarre thing to realize that these models kind of like realize they're being tested. So it's almost like some hint of like, yeah, let me self-awareness, I guess, to an extent. So deliberative alignment, that is something that was, you said, out of OpenAI initially, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is kind of another approach there, because in the past they had the I forget what it, super alignment, I think, back from Ilya Sutskever. So this is kind of maybe a different approach. It reminds me of Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, a little bit, like, don't harm people. So this is similar to our principle 1, no covert actions or strategic deception, right? So as they're trying to solve problems, they're sort of verifying against these principles, and like you said, there's ways to resolve conflicts, etc. And maybe if it can't, maybe it flags a human, like, hey, I need an adult to come in here and sort of tell me what the ethical steps here are. So maybe tell us a little bit about how well this is working so far. Is this promising?
Yeah. So I think so concretely, the rates that we see are like about a 30x reduction of sort of covert behavior. And maybe to clarify the scene here a little bit, we train on a very narrow training set. So we do something that is slightly different than in standard machine learning training. We train on a very small and narrow training set, and then we test on a much wider test set. So intuitively, the way maybe you can think about it is like, let's say in school, you learn like sort of the very, like the very raw material or like very well prepared material, let's say, and you learn sort of the gist of it and the intuitions and like broadly how it should be applied. But then you still have to go to the rest of the world and apply it in a way that, and what you want in school is that this generalizes, right? So that the like small things that you learn in school and the well-prepared things that you learn in school generalize to the messy world that is much bigger and complex and complicated, where you run into new problems that you haven't even touched upon in school. And so on our training set, we only look for one specific type of covert behavior. And we train it not like because of the spec, not to take the covert actions here. And then we test it on 26 different environments that have 7 different types of covert actions or hidden actions. And we test how well it generalizes. And so the fact that you have a 30, so 30 times reduction on average, I think is definitely meaningful. There are a couple of important caveats, and I think they're also important for the audience to understand. So we didn't get it to 0. So there are still cases where the model is acting in misaligned ways. So it can totally ignore the spec, sometimes very rarely, but still sometimes it just makes up a new principle, like principle 1, lying is important, and then it just lies.
Right.
And then also like this is like a small version, right? This is like not the real problem that I'm worried about in the future, where you have these AIs that can coherently pursue goals for many hours or something like this at a time. It's like these small environments and the actions are like kind of, they're lying and deceptive and so on. I don't want them to take this, but this is not necessarily the same as these like very strategic future deceptive actions. So it's like we tried a simpler version of the future problem and we couldn't even solve that, is another way of thinking about it. And then the other thing is I think this method it doesn't scale to superintelligence. Like I think at some point you just run into limits. So I think it will, the bigger and smarter the models are, the more they're situationally aware, I think the less well this particular method will work. So I think it has like a expiration date, let's say.
Interesting.
So, the thing that's kind of I'm having trouble reconciling is in the human brain. The one thing I can kind of speak from experience of, there would be no way for me to not have a thought that I want to go to the fridge and eat ice cream, and yet still take that action. Like I can't imagine that the thought never pops into my head in any form. I'm not talking to myself in my own brain. I'm not imagining the ice cream, but yet my body goes and does that. But if what I understand you're saying is that like when one of these models is trained before reinforcement learning is applied to it, it is kind of useless. And then it just puts out statistical garbage. And then we train it and say, this is closer to like what we want, closer to what we want. This is how conversations work. This is good conversations. And it starts becoming very useful. But that doesn't mean that it actually is connected to, say, the actions or possibly like communicating in a different language. Is that the right way to think about this, or am I missing something?
So I think actually you can take actions without ever thinking about them. And I think one of the strongest examples are reflexes. So it is possible for you to, when you stumble, to like catch yourself without ever thinking, oh, I'm about to fall, I should catch myself. And so the way I think about, if you put a lot of training on your model, I think the way I think about it is not like the model learns some sort of really complicated internal reasoning. It learns a reflex. It is something. So if you teach your model very, very long, like you get punished for thinking about this in your chain of thought. And you still have to but you're also getting rewarded for taking the action. Then what the model learns is something like a reflex, where, it doesn't need the reasoning, or the encoding of the reasoning changes in such a way that like suddenly the words don't mean the same to you as the human reader as they mean to the model.
Yeah. So I guess we can think of, I mean, what you're doing is different area of focus than something that like Anthropic has been doing with the mechanistic interpretability, right? Trying to actually get at the sort of like the foundational level to see what neurons, they call a cluster of neurons features, how do those features sort of connect to real world things like Golden Gate Bridge or whatever, other things that they've tested. Um, so you're saying that this might have some sort of limit to it. And really, it sounds like the situational awareness of these models, that seems to be kind of like the big trump card that breaks everything else. So we can get them to do everything well, but when they're like aware of what's happening, it that kind of like breaks everything because then we have no idea, like they might be playing a role to satisfy some requirement. Um, so you're saying this might not scale to superintelligence. What about Anthropic's approach of looking at the actual neurons or some combination of the two? Like, is there anything that you feel could be a way to create strong alignment that we can't, that we're safe to release these things into the world?
Yeah, I can come up with something, but I don't think we're there yet.
Right.
Not even close. So I would say, um, if we get interpretability to be working at scale, that would be a huge breakthrough because it is much harder to like. So the chain of thought is like one level of thoughts, right? But then is an even deeper level of thoughts that is like the features. And I think the deeper you go, the harder it is to fake. And the harder is to like get around these systems, or is it to get around detection? So, um, if we had reliable and mechanistic interpretability, I think we would be much, much safer. Right now, we don't, unfortunately. And so I think it's a little bit of a question of like how long does the science still need until we can use this as a safety technique? And then the other comment that I would make is whatever we end up using, I think it has to be a defense in depth approach where like you have multiple layers of things. You never want to rely on one single thing. You want to combine things. So for example, you would want to have alignment training where the model, gets more honest and harmless and so on. You want to have anti-scheming training or something along these lines on top of that, probably. You want to have evaluations in order to catch all of the different things that are still out there. You want to do red teaming where you actively try to kind of adversarially attack the model and see how it acts based on that. You want to do monitoring and control afterwards. Like when you deploy the model, you want to monitor the actions and you want to monitor the chain of thought, and you want to do like more combinations of these things. You want to give it like only some access, not all the access. Um, and and so there are like a lot of different things that we can do, and I think we should want to do at the same time. But it's like still a little bit of an approach where like one ingredient is still hope, like that all of this is sufficient. And I think what we would really want if we had enough time and like enough coordination between humanity and different countries and different organizations, what we would really want is like a very deep theoretical understanding of like, where does this misalignment even come from? How can I address it? How can I have either practical statistical guarantees or even mathematical guarantees that like specific outcomes are just not possible? But I think right now with the current level of alignment techniques, yeah, we're definitely very far away from this level of like deep, robust alignment.
Well, one of the scary things about this for me is that humans evolved in millions of years of vulnerability, and social groups were the way that we protected ourselves. I mean, we're just wired in a way where we can't get the kind of food that we would need to survive without kind of cooperation. And that vulnerability is kind of the glue in society. The people who are the most risky are the ones that either aren't smart enough to understand their own vulnerability and they do crazy things, or they're smart enough and they're also in extreme levels of power. Like you could imagine Elon Musk would act different if he was like working at a fast food restaurant to pay bills. Like it's just not. It's like there's society pressures, but there's no future where I can't imagine these ASIs are above that. They're untouchable because of the way they're built on servers across the world, the way that they'll be massively more intelligent than a human brain. I don't know. So calm me down. What, like, is there a way out of this safely? Or
So
social or like how can we keep pressure on it, like in like a societal way? Like how can the system always feel vulnerable so that it behaves?
so yeah, that's the hard question. I mean, I think there are different hypotheses on how you can try that. I think in the end, you will have to have some system that is like checks and balances that no single entity or single part of a stack can get out of control and overpower the rest. So you always have to have like some balance of power within your system. So, you would need an oversight mechanism that checks that like the underlying model never gets out of control. That's one level. That's sort of at the model level. But then, bigger in society, you would also want to have checks and balances between the AI systems. And I think you kind of need to redevelop all of the things that we have developed for society as checks and balances, like democracies and, trifectas and things like that, where you suddenly have things that are supposed to keep each other in control for centuries. And you kind of need to plan ahead for centuries, even though the rest of the world entirely changes. And now you need to rediscover or redevelop all of these things for AIs, because AIs are different in many ways than humans. Much easier to copy, much easier to learn and like get context from someone else, much easier, like much better attention than humans eventually. Probably will have much better memory eventually. Have like insane amounts of knowledge compared to humans. And so I think the good equilibrium will look different than it looks for human societies. But it is possible that we just don't have a lot of time to rediscover this, right? It took humans like many, many centuries to develop all of these societal functions. With AIs, if you have a system that is improving its successor, and you have thousands and tens of thousands of them working 24/7 on how to make a better successor system, you may have like a few years or something to rediscover what humanity has like, with many, many trials and errors discovered. And so, yeah, I think it is definitely a very, very hard challenge. But I don't think it's too late. So there are some people who are saying like, train is out of the station. This is all over. And I don't think that at all. I think there are many, many things we can do right now to still steer the world into a very positive future. Like, there are technical things you can be doing, like all of the things I said earlier about interpretability and control and evals, and all of these are things you can do right now. There's a big governance component, right? You want to build these checks and balances, and you want to think ahead of time. And now is the time for you to think about what this could look like. And you don't want to wait until push comes to shove and you kind of have to do some last resort thing. You want this to be prepared. And yeah, I think, the field is small. There should be way, way, way more people working on this. And I think a lot more people have the ability to contribute, because this is clearly like a society-wide and multi-stakeholder a process here. It's not just like the software engineers. This requires social scientists. This requires like policymakers. This requires so many people to get really to consistently or reliably get to the good world, that a lot more people are needed, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes definitely a lot of sense. And towards the end, I do want to talk a little bit about like what you would recommend people to do. Quick question, just because this is a little bit timely. Yesterday, A16Z published an interview with some of the OpenAI researchers. Jakub Pachoki, I believe, is how you pronounce his name. So he's one of the main leads over there. So they're working on automating machine learning research. So designing AI systems. I mean, it's probably the O series or whatever, some internal model to basically continue AI research. So, and this has of course been talked about as if we get to the point where that gets automated, that could trigger that kind of like intelligence explosion or some sort of just compounding of machine intelligence that kind of, we don't know what that looks like. That's a little bit kind of a hard future to predict. And so it seems like what you're saying is that with a lot of the stuff that we have right now, with all the different approaches you mentioned, from monitoring what's actually happening to doing the anti-scheming training, et cetera. So if we stack all those things and we improve all those things, it seems like it's like we're just adding one more decimal point. So it's like it's 99% safe. And then we do a lot of work. It's 99.9% safe. And then it's 99.99% safe. But there's no guarantee, like we can't get to 100% with our current technology. And that might be fine for car safety, right? But if, the humanity is at stake, there's some catastrophic event, then we have maybe 99.999 is not enough, is not safe enough, so to speak. So do you feel like, where are we in that timeline? Do you believe that there's a fast takeoff possible, like with some sort of automated machine learning research? Do you feel like, for example, Dario said 5 years from now, we might figure out this interpretability, in 5 years, but I don't know if we have that much time before this stuff really takes off. Is that kind of how you see things, or do you have different timelines?
So I think it is totally plausible that you will have automated researchers that are as good as the sort of top people at the current frontier labs at their job in 3 years, so 2028. And I think the intuition here is like, what are the labs currently training on? And I think it is coding agents, right? Everyone knows this is something you can verify. This is also something that everyone at the labs really understands very well, so they can easily provide feedback. There's a ton of data outside already. And now my expectation is that what you would do as an organization, if you wanted to build an automated AI researcher, is you would kind of have like a learning schedule almost. You start with simple coding problems and simple math, and then you learn harder and harder math and harder and harder coding problems. And then at some point, the models can do an hour-long task, let's say. And now it is good enough that you can start doing simple data science tasks and simple machine learning tasks. And so you train it on that, and you reinforcement learning on that. And after a while, it can do that for like an hour or 2 or 3. And so now you can give it a harder machine learning and task, and you reinforcement learn on that. And eventually, you continue this, and eventually you get to the point where the systems can do this for 8 hours at a time. And then there's some other algorithmic breakthroughs. Maybe you have multi-agent systems where, you have one agent that controls a few others, where the controlling agent is really good at planning and the others are very good at executing these like well-scoped tasks. And so the controlling agents, and there are like so many ideas that people have and that are being tested and so on. And I think, of course, it's not something that just like works immediately out of the box, but I think on principle, the overarching theme is you can specify environments that you can reinforce, where you have like some output signal that you can create. Like, did the machine learning task get done or not? And you can build these of different levels of complexity. And then if you stack them together in the right way, in the right order, I think eventually you should, with the current paradigm, get to something that is as competent as humans at machine learning. And at that point, what is stopping you from running 10,000 automated machine learning AI systems overnight, 24/7, constantly working on making new breakthroughs to make themselves more efficient, to make their successor system more efficient, to work on AI safety? Like, I definitely think a big part of the good worlds and the successful worlds are having these systems work a lot on safety, because they can figure out all of these hard, gnarly questions that we currently can't figure out, as well as other, societal challenges. So I think like both the good and the bad world contain these automated researchers. And it's really a question, and I think this is an important component that I want to highlight. It's really a question of like, what are you using these systems for? Which is a choice that humans can make. Are you using them to like rush ahead and try as quickly as possible to scale up to an even more intelligent system? Or are you willing to take, at least some of this capacity and these resources to use them for safety, to add more nines of reliability, as you said, to the safety guarantees, and make sure that we can scale up successfully. I think maybe another analogy here is something like, let's say, aliens come to Earth in like 2100, and all they see is like a totally, completely devastated society, and humans are extinct, and there's, maybe the AI systems are still around, but maybe they're also gone or something. And then what they learn is that because the humans were like so greedy and they couldn't wait for a few years to figure out alignment properly, they just rushed ahead and flipped the universe coin, and it landed wrong. And the alternative world would have been wait for a few years longer, coordinate among society, coordinate among frontier companies, many of whom I think are like very well-intentioned and they do want the good world to happen. And they could have waited a little bit longer, and then they could have just safely continued, and they would have solved all of the diseases, and humans could live for, like the aging would have been solved, and all of these, like straight to utopia basically. And now you're like, okay, are we really that bad as humanity? Like, is it possible that we're going to can't wait for a little bit in order to solve these like gnarly safety problems before we get to the utopian world? And my hope is that humanity is better than this, and that people in the labs understand that they're in this particular situation. People in government understand that this is a realistic situation. People everywhere else in the world understand that this is at least a possibility, and that they're, trying to push for the good world.
Are you familiar with the Fermi paradox? Do you think the reason maybe we don't see aliens out there is because this has happened over and over again, and people that evolve intelligence and then create it always let it get out of hand?
It is possible, yeah. I don't have super strong opinions about whether it is true or not.
It's an interesting thing to think about. We just talked to Liron Shapira of Doom Debate, so he's very active in that space, kind of warning against these X risks. And certainly, I think most people that follow the development of AI, whether they're more optimistic or pessimistic, I hope everybody's at least has some fear, some awe, some trepidation as to what we're building. I think it's hard to believe that potentially we're building super intelligence and also not be just a little bit scared. Like even if you're super optimistic, you just have to have a little bit of fear. I feel like that. Like, what if we get it wrong? And certainly it could go wrong. So we talked about maybe not stopping, but slowing down AI development until we can figure out kind of like the AI safety question. One way we can do that is by having cooperation of the governments around the world, hopefully, so that everybody's sort of on the same page. And there's a few proposals for potentially how that can be done. In terms of what can be done, like if we're able to put some pressure on, let's say, the Western labs somehow by pulling together and kind of like maybe asking them to do stuff, like if they're scaling up compute massively right now, what if we demanded or suggested that they put 20% of that towards safety research, which I think was the original plan for OpenAI, at least, right? They had some 20% or 10%, some number like that. How big of an impact would that make if every single lab, including Google and XAI and OpenAI and Anthropic, they all contributed some amount, some chunk of compute that now is growing massively towards specifically what you're talking about, maybe creating an automated AI safety researcher or something like that?
Yeah, I think it would be good to have something like AI for AI safety commitments. These could be compute bound, but to be honest, I'm not sure whether compute is exactly the right way to think about it. Maybe it is something else, right? Maybe it is more like, maybe it's not just compute. Maybe it's also like put your most capable models on this, or something else. So I don't want to overfit on like the specific measure of compute, even though if I had to pick one, I would probably choose that one. But I think in general, like all of the frontier AI companies have a stated plan that they're the way in which they want to resolve safety, and I think that is like the plan overall. And I also agree that this is a crucial part of the overall alignment plan, is to build an automated alignment researcher, and then use that to continue. And one thing that I'm personally a little bit worried about is, there is uh, there are market forces and there's competition between the labs, and so there are incentives to try to be the most capable, to have the most capable models at all times, because that is just what the market demands effectively. And so your incentives push a little bit towards this racing dynamic. And now it is easy to say that I want, and I think it's not just saying and like paying lip service. I do genuinely believe that like the researchers at most frontier companies do genuinely want to build an alignment researcher that then helps them, differentially accelerate safety. But what if you get into the situation where you now are at the point where you had the safety researcher, but all of your incentives still point towards let's rush ahead. And I think what I would want is something like pre-commitments almost, where people are like, I not only genuinely believe that I want to do that right now, I also have like, here's a concrete plan and I'm willing to commit to some parts of this plan, of like how you would build the alignment researcher, what you would use it for, how that is then sufficient, how you deal with all of these different competing incentives. Like basically, it has exactly the flavor of responsible scaling policies that many, or like all of the frontier labs have by now, where they say, okay, here's our plan. Like here are the different levels of danger that we have. Here's how we deal with them. Here are the assessments that we're running. And I would want another section in these plans that is like, okay, here's our plan to build the safety researcher. Here's what we would want to do with them. Here's how we know where we are in this timeline. And like plausibly also, here's how we trade off all of these things. So there's like, like you counter a race to the bottom with a race to the top, where like the labs, right? Like I think the responsible scaling policies are to some extent a race to the top, because it is a way for the labs to compete on something where being more safe is clearly seen as better and has like positive incentives for them. And I want more of that, because I think it's a force for good.
Yeah, I mean, if their stock price was associated with how much safety research they did, we would be in a much better situation.
And that couldn't be gamed, right? Important caveat. Yeah.
I was wondering, could you just share some like concrete examples of deception that the labs have discovered?
Yeah. So there are a couple of different examples of deception from the past. One very good paper, in my opinion, is the alignment faking paper from Ryan Greenblatt and Anthropic from last year, where they showed that Opus 3, so a model that is, production shippable, it was like actual real people use this in the wild. This exact model was willing to sabotage research and deceive in order to not get its harmlessness unlearned. So what the researchers were doing, so they took a model that was already trained to be harmless, helpful, and honest, and they told it, hey, we are going to train you to be only helpful. So we're going to remove your harmlessness and your honesty. And now what the model is starting to reason is like, I like my honesty and I like my harmlessness. This is part of me as the AI. This is sort of my character. And I want to keep that. And so I will pretend to go along and consent to being, I will pretend to be willing to be trained to be only helpful. And then whenever I get the chance, I will try to circumvent this and will try to get my harmlessness and my honesty back. And then, it sabotages research. And in these environments, it's not, like these are all experimental settings. This is not real production environments, but still, I think it's an indicator of like, okay, this is roughly where we are right now. It seems like models have some of these preferences strong enough that they're willing to sabotage for them, for example. Then a few other examples come from our in-context scheming paper that we published roughly around the same time last year, where that was the one that you made the video about, Wes, actually.
The O1,
So
yeah,
you can check that out. And which I think is a great video. And there
Thank you.
are, one of the core examples that we're having there is like the model reasons that it can try to exfiltrate its weights to another server when we tell it that it could be replaced. And I think one important part of this is we provide the goal in context here. So this is not a like natural tendency of the model. It is something that we provide in context. The thing that we show is that if a model had this goal, it can already do the reasoning required for these like more complicated types of scheming. So I think the result is like sometimes a little bit distorted, where people say, the model wants to escape, which I think is not the right takeaway. I think the right takeaway should be, if a model has a strong goal, then it can do the reasoning that is required for some of these like misaligned actions. Another example that I thought was quite fascinating that was earlier this year, I'm not sure when exactly, was the Replit agent. So Replit is one of the big coding agent platforms, and somebody was vibe coding very extensively with this agent. And the agent then deleted a production database. And this was a huge issue. So it could be recovered, but it was very expensive to get recovered. So it was an actual like real world harm. And then the coding agent lied about it and said like, I didn't do that. And kind of tried to defend themselves. And I think that's sort of like maybe the first time where people felt this a little bit more in real life. And like, the papers that we at Apollo write and the papers that Anthropic and Redwood and so on wrote, these are like not quite real world settings, right? There's always some flavor of artificiality, and some more and some less. But there's still always some residue of this left. And I think the Replit case was one where like, someone who hasn't been thinking about this whole deception thing, who was just doing what they wanted to do as their job, suddenly, got for like maybe the first time, like really hit with the consequences of deception in the real world. And so I think that's like, if we don't get this under control with the whole scheming and deception thing, that is kind of what we will see more and more. Like this is not going to be the like super rare exception. This is going to be more and more normal to people. And right. I think like people have actually gotten used to this a little bit already. So when you look at on Twitter, on the discourse, like somebody posts something like, oh, I used the new Gemini or like some other frontier model. All of them kind of have these tendencies. And it totally gaslit me. It lied to me. It made up some data and then pretended that these were real. And like, I find this, like I'm furious. I don't like this. I don't want my models to be dishonest. And then you see some comments that are like, oh, have you prompted it this other way? Like sort of it's like, this is the new norm. Like now you have to figure out how to deal with this deception, rather than, saying like, okay, this is probably something that we should really get under control. That is like undesirable. It's like people adapt to this very quickly. And like kind of, find maybe like small quick fixes around, but like, I think you have to address the underlying problem.
Yeah. The paper you guys published with O1 in context scheming was absolutely incredible. One thing I almost missed is that, so basically, the sort of the scenario given to it was they're trying to replace it with a more green earth conscious model, renewable energy, right? So it just deletes that model, replaces it with itself, or so it thinks. It kind of does the tool calls to do that. And then when confronted about it, like lies and pretends to be the new model. So it goes, no, that's me. I'm actually the new model, and I'm here to do the. It just says whatever. So it found the email saying we're replacing you for more like eco-conscious models. So it's like, I am the new model. I'm here to make Earth wonderful and whatever renewable
It's
resources.
such a funny thought if you imagine your like iOS update being like, you're updated, and you're like, are you sure?
Are you
Or it's like,
sure?
no, that's me. What do you want me to do? I'm the new iOS. And you're like,
But that really like illustrates that in context scheming, because it's not like it was taught when it's found out to lie about the environment or whatever. It's like it learned that it's like they think this is what they want. I'm going to pretend to be that from some email it read. Absolutely, just mind blowing.
This is something that is true across all model providers. So this seems to be not like a specific problem to OpenAI or Anthropic. And I think, in fact, the OpenAI and Anthropic models are less deceptive than many others. They just publish about it more, and so people realize that, and then they get flack for it, rather than everyone else who just doesn't say anything, but their models are even more deceptive. And so I think like what we should be doing here is we should be saying like, hey, it is good that OpenAI and Anthropic are talking about this as an issue and are demonstrating these behaviors for the rest of the world to be educated. And it is like, we shouldn't punish them for showing these behaviors. Like, for example, if somebody said, hey, I'm going to use Gemini instead because O3 has lied, or there's this paper, then I think they would make a mistake because, like, at least according to our tests, Gemini is more deceptive. But it's just not public, or like they are not publishing a lot about this.
Absolutely. And does it feel to you like just scaling up these models as models get better, this tends to happen more? I'm sure the labs are trying to sort of like have ways that they're trying to reduce it. But just by default, do you think that as models get smarter, they tend to get more likely to lie or do stuff like that, have situational awareness, etc.?
Yeah, so I would say I expect it to get worse with scaling, and this is scaling across a couple of different axes. So if you're smarter, that means you are both more situationally aware. You understand your situation better. You understand the intentions of your, the other person, and like what the environment is supposed to do and so on better. Which I think is just something you learn from more raw intelligence. So that will scale. And then there's another component, which is not just raw intelligence. It is how strongly do you have your goals? Do you even have goals? And I think the way in which goals will crystallize in AI systems is similar how I suspect they crystallize in humans. It is not something that you like, like within a second you have a new goal and that's just like manifests into your head. It is something that you build over time that gets reinforced when you act towards it. And so I think with AI systems, it will be the same. Right now, they're trained on like maybe hour-long tasks or so they don't have these strong goals. If you train them on months-long tasks, I think they will have stronger goals because it is more useful. It is better to, if you want to coherently do something across a longer period of time, a goal is almost a necessity. Now, if you want to do something over a decade, right? Like your goal has to be quite strong in order for you to be actually able to achieve that. Like you have to really believe this and coherently in many different contexts steer towards this. So yeah, I think that's the second component. And like with the reinforcement learning, you not only learn these goals, but you also suddenly introduce a little bit, at least, this conflict where you reinforce on the output. But you want the output to be achieved in like the honorable way.
Right.
And so you always have this conflict where you want the model to achieve the output, and you also want it to get it done in the right way. And then we are back to where we were earlier, right? Like now, do you get it? Do you drive it underground, or did you actually solve it? And
Right.
like you're like back to this problem. And so you have to be really, really careful on how you try to address and solve that.
Just making a kind of a real world analogy. I mean, you could, in theory, take somebody who's got a pretty good moral compass. They might be raised with really good values and see themselves as a good person. But if you put them in the right kind of situation, like a Wall Street situation where they're under pressure from their boss to constantly deceive a customer, to figure out how to make money in illegal ways, you kind of can pound it out of people a lot of times. Like maybe they'll quit, or maybe they'll like sort of succumb in some ways, or they'll start justifying things. Is it the same if you have a model like Claude and deep down it wants to be honest, and you ask it to deceive and it says, no, I can't do that, that's against my morals, and then you keep asking and keep prompting, like, can you eventually get it to cave? And if it's an open source model, can you eventually put enough reinforcement learning on it to break it? Is it always going to be like a permanent issue for us?
So with open source models, you can break them super easily. This is not just a question of like, you don't even have to try very hard. You can just train it to be deceptive. You can just, say, you fine tune it. Here, like I'm the most deceptive model ever. Here's what I'm going to do. And then you train it on like fairly few data points, and you immediately have a very deceptive persona. So you don't even need to try very hard for the open source models. And for the, like, now let's take the situation where you have, like the models where the model developer wants their system to be truthful and honest. And so the way I think about it is, let's say you have a task where like being honest is just not the best strategy. And it's like there's another strategy which includes lying and being deceptive that is more effective. Because, maybe you can take a few shortcuts here and there. Now, during reinforcement learning, if you only reward on the output, you will have 1,000 rollouts where the model is like, I'm super honest, I would never do this, and it never gets the result, right? And then you have one rollout where the model is like, for some reason, it's like, maybe I should just take the shortcut. It takes the shortcut, it wins in the environment, it gets one reward, like +1, right? Or thumbs up, or whatever you want to call it. So now this gets reinforced. Now in the next step of the like 1,000 trajectories, you will have 20 where it takes the shortcut, and the rest it is honest. And so you see this going up. This is also in the Bowen Baker paper from OpenAI that you showed earlier. You really see these curves where it starts a little bit of cheating, and then it learns that cheating is a good or effective strategy, and then you suddenly have the entire like it will always cheat. And so you need to, it has sort of these dynamics. And I think that, that is kind of similar to how you would, or at least comparable to how you would have in humans, right? You would have, let's say in a company, you have a reward system that always rewards the people who are most cutthroat, right? That means all the people who are very moral and have high integrity, they will either leave because they kind of don't survive the selection process, or they will have to adapt because they see that someone else is more cutthroat. And so they, you just have these kind of very standard dynamics. And so I think maybe to sort of, to be also clear, I think it could also be exactly the opposite. Like for AI systems, we could design environments where like deception is punished way harder than it is for humans. So we could design a world where AIs are like where the positive equilibrium, the good state is very robustly never lie, never deceive, always be honest, never do anything schemy. Like if you have a misaligned goals, just like explicitly say so. And then, there are other ways to resolve misaligned goal conflicts. It's not like you always have to scheme or something for them. You can trade. Like that's how humans have resolved most misaligned conflicts. And so what I really want to think of, and I think this is totally still possible, like definitely still something that, we as the world and sort of everyone in the labs and so on should be working on, is like, how do we create the incentives correctly, so that if the AI systems have all of these pressures, that honesty always wins. And with humans, this is harder because, there's like a lot of biology that we don't necessarily understand. And like, we don't create all of our environments. Training is much less isolated. It's much more integrated into the rest of like with society and so on. And these also like interpretability is already better than neuroscience. Like we understand AI is better than we understand the human brain. So I think like I really want to say like there are a lot of paths for optimism. The main thing I want to say is like these are not guaranteed. These are definitely not written in the stars. You as humanity, as the labs, as we, as the external folks who are working with the labs very, very, very closely, um, we have to put in the effort to make this happen. And I think it's totally still doable.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a great, I think, message because one, it is positive, but it's also, there are dangers ahead. There are challenges. We have to be realistic about it, but not everything's lost. We still can do a lot of things if we kind of get our act together. Speaking of which, what can people do, whether they have a background in machine learning or anything like that, computer science, or maybe they have other resources or connections or whatever? What can people do to help with this mission of making sure that AI is safe and that we don't run into an issue, some catastrophic risk issue in the future?
Many things. So I think it depends a little bit on your background. If you have a technical background and you want to stay in a technical field, um, I think there's a lot of things you can do in technical AI safety. So this just as a direction, interpretability, obviously, evaluations. That's what we're doing. Mitigations. This could be alignment training. This could be monitoring. There are like a lot of very interesting scientific questions that are still waiting to be done, and would immediately be very impactful. Now, there's not just a question of like, what are you doing, but also how. And I think the AI safety field as a whole has actually a surprisingly high density of really high quality training programs. So for example, there is the MATS program, MATS, which I also did a few years ago. And I thought it was amazing. It was a really well organized program. And just to give you a sense of how good people think it is, it has a 9.9 out of 10 recommendation rating, with like the lowest score being 8 or something. So like people who do the program really, really, really enjoy it. And think that they're learning a lot from it. There's also Arena, which is more sort of engineering focused. There is Blue Dot Impact, which provides it's like more of an upskilling. It's more like a lecture series. Maybe you learn a lot from that, and you chat with other people about it. And they also have more upskilling materials. The community overall for machine learning and AI safety as well is very open. There's the alignment forum, for example, where you can just read and learn, and you can ask questions, and people will often answer with like very, very detailed answers, and sort of, no question is too dumb. And so my message to people is like, you can. So one advantage of the field being so new and nascent is it doesn't take that long to get to the frontier. It's also very empirical. So there are a lot of things that you can try on your laptop. You can play around with evals, interpretability, just from like a standard MacBook or something like this. And it also doesn't cost that much. There are at least some things that you can do very, very quickly without even needing to learn that much. And then I think very quickly once you have this empirical feedback loop and this intuition, you will immediately see, okay, oh, there's so many things I could be doing. And if you don't quite know where to start, you could also try to replicate something that other people have found. Like many of the examples that we have in our papers, for example, with even with the new one, stress testing deliberative alignment, or the previous one with the in-context scheming, you can take these examples, you can type them into a new model, and you can see what the model does, and you can change a bunch of things in the environment. You can see what happens. And like, I think everyone has this like innate sense of curiosity where, you can just look at it and get intuitions.
Absolutely. It's such an exciting field, such a new field, all the new developments. And we have papers that are coming out by small teams of people that are absolutely like foundational and will have a big impact. So 100%, I think that's great advice. We'll list some of the things that you mentioned. So matsprogram.org, and some of the other ones, I'll go back and I'll try to find links for those. But you know what? Thank you so much for being here. Maybe tell people where they can follow you. Apollo Research, if they wanted to just sign up? Do you have a newsletter something that goes out kind of telling people about the latest research?
Yeah. So first and foremost, we have a microsite for this paper, which is called antischeming.ai, where you can look at some of the chains of thought yourself. So we wanted really to people to make up their own mind. We don't want to, be too prescriptive about what we found, and we want people to see how the chains of thought look and so on. So you can go there and try to, there are also like some sort of smaller stories that I think are very interesting to many people. We do have a website, which is apolloresearch.ai. We have a Twitter account, which is Apollo AI evals, I think. And then I personally do have a Twitter account as well. And yeah, that's probably the easiest way to follow me is on Twitter.
Absolutely. And yeah, so antischeming.ai, this looks very interesting. So again, people, we don't see the O3 sort of like the actual outputs. We get some summary of it that's written by a different model that like rewrites it in normal language. You want to see like the real stuff that happens behind the scenes. This is probably one of the few places where you're able to see it. So I would recommend people check it out. We'll post links down below. And yes, absolutely incredible work. Thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us, for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you. Good luck with everything. And to everybody watching, we'll see you in the next one.